Welcome to CHI's Existential Detective Fiction class. We are in week 7, looking at dreams and the unconscious. Last week, we explored Sartre's being and nothingness as a model for becoming an existential detective, looking to how our ability to inquire creates nothingness, how that nothingness is the center of freedom, how our freedom creates anguish, and how our anguish leads to self-deception. That's kind of the structure of the lecture. We ended the class by discussing the cases that Sartre investigated, the girl, the waiter, the homosexual, and the critic, and at his method for interpreting them through the lens of the nothingness that each involves. We concluded by discussing how the fact of our freedom leads us to posit our facticity, or our transcendence, as something that's determined rather than free. Freedom, after all, according to Sartre, causes anguish. Looking at ourselves as determined thereby allows us to escape from anguish and find peace within our lives. And for Sartre, that's the point of self-deception. Does that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This week, we turn to Freud to see his exploration of the existential heart of the human being. His insights, which Sartre completely rejected, look to the unknowable center of human selves, what he calls the unconscious. We will briefly cover the reason for his inquiry, the method he undertakes, and the cases he attempts to resolve. Throughout, we'll explore the question, in what way are the motives behind many of our decisions hidden from us, and to what extent are we able to become conscious of them? So, here we go. We'll start by looking at chapter 2, which is his section on dream interpretation. He begins chapter 2 of the interpretation of dreams by discussing the two popular methods of dream interpretations. He dislikes the assumption prevalent in theories of dream interpretation that hold, quote, to interpret a dream means to determine its meaning, to substitute for it something that fits into the chain of our psychical acts as a full and equally valid member, end quote. Science claims that it's simply a somatic process at odds with the popular opinion that wants to see dreams as, quote, a substitute for another mode of thinking, and that it is only a matter of finding a right way to reveal this substitute for the hidden significance of dreams to be disclosed. Okay, so you have science that just says it's the brain that just, it's thought, but it's uncontrolled thought. It's just kind of random stuff. It's meaningless. You know, popular opinion, which says, you know, this means everything, right? Dreams, they're true. They're telling us something. And Freud wants to say, not exactly either of those. You know, he wants to find a middle way between those, to say that it's not exactly random, but it doesn't really have predictive power either in the same way that people really hold to it. He then looks at two common procedures for dream interpretation. This is page 79. Number 1, symbolism. This is where the interpreter takes the dream content as a whole and seeks to replace it with a different, intelligible, and in certain respects analogous content. So these are the like if you get a book of dream interpretation, if you dream of a candle, that can be replaced in dream code by passion or love. If you dream of X, you can replace that with Y. A dream about Y, you can replace with Z, you know, or so on and so forth, right? And that's how a lot of those kinds of dream books work. They take the dream and they have a different dream with a different kind of content, okay? This is what the dream means. The second way of going about it is what he calls decoding. And this is what treats the dream as this kind of secret writing in which every sign is translated by means of a fixed key into another sign whose significance is known. So symbolism looks at the dream as a whole, whereas the decoder ring, actually this is probably a better example of decoder, takes each part of the dream, right? So you don't really just have a dream about a candle. You know, like if there's a candle in a dark room in a forest. Okay, well, candle means this, dark room means this, forest means that, and after you add it all together, voila, here's the recipe. The symbolism approach just takes it as a whole, like, oh, it was one of these, it was a dream about bugs. Bug dreams, in the more vast sense, mean this. Does that make sense? Those are the two methods that he lists. Page 80, Freud then offers this thesis. This is what his argument is, quote, dreams are the ancient, stubbornly held popular belief seems to have come closer to the truth of things than the judgment of contemporary science. I have to maintain that dreams really do possess a meaning and that a scientific method of dream interpretation is possible. Okay, so what he wants to do is say the popular opinion would say that there's some meaning here is true, and he wants to weld these together by looking at how science can help to uncover what that meaning is. He's not a fan of these approaches. He wants to be more scientific and more consistent with how he approaches it, right? But he thinks that this has more to do with the truth than what most scientists believe. So he defends this thesis by explaining the origin of the method. He was working with Joseph Breuer as a therapist and found that, quote, for unraveling certain psychopathological structures, the unraveling, the cure, solution, and resolution amount to the same thing. If one has been able to trace a pathological idea of this sort back to the elements in the patient's life which produced it, then it will disintegrate and the patient will be freed from it. Okay, so basically when he's dealing with people with various mental illnesses, he looks at the patient's life, he looks at the symptoms from which they suffer, and he starts to tell a story that connects these symptoms to what happened in the patient's life. Once the patient is able to repeat that story back with conviction, it's true, and the patient's relieved from suffering. Now, in the beginning, Freud doesn't know why this works. He just knows that it's efficacious, right? It frees his patients from suffering, and then he starts to think about why that might be. In his thinking about why that might be, he starts to look at dreams as kind of part of that same sort of process, or that same part of psychological structure. Even though there's not as much suffering attached to dreams, nonetheless, what a dream is comes from the same kind of thinking that a symptom does. And it still relates to some sort of narrative or some sort of story or something that needs to be put into language that differs from either the physiological or the psychological language of a symptom or a dream. Does that make sense? Okay. So he connected symptoms with interpretation of dreams because when patients describe their dreams, he learned, here's a quote from him, page 81, that a dream can be interpolated into this psychical chain which, starting from a pathological idea, can be traced backwards in the memory. This suggested that the dream itself might be treated as a symptom, and that the method of interpretation developed for symptoms might be applied to dreams. So that's Freud's words on the matter. As a therapist, then, Freud functions as a detective, examining the cases his patients present, cases in which dreams become clues to the elusive mystery that upsets and unsettles their lives. The case is solved or cured when the illness is able to be explained. Patients are freed when an explanation undermines the idea's whole. In other words, the therapist's job is like the job of the detective in a classic mystery story, right? Like, oh, the mystery seemed impossible. Well, let's walk through. Behold, there's the killer, right? Except in Freud's case, is behold, here's the pathological idea that's generating all of these symptoms that you're suffering from. And the same thing happens. Once the killer is revealed or the idea is revealed, everything is okay. Okay? So, for this to function, Freud stresses the importance of helping patients promote self-observation and to relax their critical faculties. This is necessary because reflecting, rather than observing, requires the use of a critical activity. Quote, once he has become aware of the ideas arising within him, he rejects some and cuts others off short so that he does not pursue the paths of thought they might open for him. Other thoughts never become conscious at all, suppressed before they're observed. Okay? So what he notices when people are talking about their dreams, there are two ways of going about it. One is just to talk about it, right? And that's self-observation. It's becoming more aware of how this self simply is or occurs in a moment-by-moment time. And as the self is self-observant, you just sort of narrate that. The other way to look at it is in terms of the critic, which says, rather than observing just where you are, the critic interrupts and says, no, we're not going to do that. No. And there's a whole bunch of blockages in the flow of that. And for Freud, that needs to be avoided at all costs because that critic is protecting something under here, which is the heart of the mystery. Page 82. Freud defines dreams as the eruption of, quote, involuntary ideas, end quote, that emerge through the reduction of a certain willed and certainly critical operation, which we usually call tiredness, that become transformed into visual and acoustic images. That's the dream. It's an involuntary idea that comes when we're tired, that's transformed into a visual and acoustic image, but there's a transformation that takes place with that. Does that make sense? That's the dream. Freud then discusses his strategy for helping defamiliarize dreams for patients, to make the object of attention the separate parts of the dream's content and not the dream as a whole. Right? So rather than saying, oh, I had this dream, and give kind of like the two-sentence nutshell of the dream, what Freud asks his patients to do is just talk about the individual elements that one can remember out from the dream. Not tell it as a story, but just to look around the space of the dream and describe everything that you can remember about it. To demonstrate this, Freud decides to use one of his own dreams, lets him avoid violating HIPAA restrictions, which didn't exist exactly, but you know what I mean, and become more detailed than what most reported dreams allow. So Freud offers a preamble concerning a patient of his, Irma, whose therapy had terminated in a partial success. He also mentioned words from his friend Otto, which indicate criticism. He then describes his dream in detail and provides an interpretation of the dream, whole paragraphs of stream of consciousness thoughts that attach to key phrases that he used to re-narrate the dream. There are a few moments within this that I want to point out. So I mean, as you're looking through, it's a huge dream. There's a lot of just his thinking about why these words in the dream are notable. Like everything he can throw at that word, he throws out that word. A few quick things. Number one, footnote 4 in the chapter states this, quote, I have a feeling that the interpretation of this part is not taken far enough to follow all its hidden meaning. If I were to pursue the comparison of the three women, I would digress too far. Every dream has at least one place where it is unfathomable, the navel, as it were, by which it is connected to the unknown. And I love that notion of the navel of dreams, that which connects it to the unfathomable that defies all explanation, right? I mean, Freud just says, there's something here, it can't be known. Like, it's too much, it can't be interpreted. And that's part of what the dream structure is. There's just some stuff that goes way too deep. You're not going to figure it out.
But he's saying we can identify the navel itself.
Yeah, you can say, oh, this is one of the navels, right? This is the navel point. You might have one or two. I mean, there might be more than one, but there's at least one navel of a dream where it's just unfathomable. I don't know. It's just a neat idea. And it's buried in a footnote, so look for it and find it. Number 2. In his explanation of the word dysentery that appears in his description of the dream, Freud finds that, quote, I have already taken revenge on 2 people in this dream. On Irma with the words, if you are still having pain, it's really only your own fault. And on Dr. M with the wording of the nonsensical consolation I've put in his mouth. Okay? And I point that out only because it highlights part of what makes the dream satisfying to Freud. He enjoys the dream in part because it takes revenge on 2 different people who have irritated him. Number 3. I want to give a full example of how he interprets one of the dream parts. And so again, he narrates the dream, he breaks the dream down into all of its little parts. One of the parts is, quote, probably the syringe was not clean either, right? He writes that down when he's thinking about the dream. And this is everything that goes into it, just to kind of give a little bit of the flavor of how his dream interpretation works. He says, quote, another criticism of Otto, but one with its origin elsewhere. Yesterday, I happened to meet the son of a lady of 82, to whom I have to administer 2 injections of morphia daily. They don't do that quite so much anymore. She is at present staying in the country, and I learned that she is suffering from phlebitis. I thought at once that there must have been an infiltration caused by a contaminated syringe. It is my pride that over a period of 2 years, I have not introduced a single infiltration. I take constant care to be sure to see that the syringe is clean. I am simply conscientious. From phlebitis, I come back to my wife, who suffered from a blockage of the veins during a pregnancy. And now 3 similar situations surface in my memory involving my wife, Irma, and the dead Matilda. The identity of these situations has clearly given me the right to substitute these 3 people for one another in my dream. All of that comes out of probably the syringe was not clean either. He's a powerful thinker. What's interesting, though, is how many thoughts he can connect into a constellation that centers around that phrase. Right? It's his practice over 2 years. It's his wife's pregnancy. It's a dead woman. You know, it's somebody who has phlebitis. It's all of those things all constellate around a phrase that has nothing in particular to do with any of them. Right? They just, as he thinks about the phrase, that's what comes to the foreground, and that's what he uses as the basis of an interpretation. Does that make sense? Freud concludes this section with this statement, quote, "I have now completed the interpretation of the dream. During this work, I had trouble in keeping at bay all the many ideas which were bound to be set going by the comparison between the dream content and the dream thoughts concealed behind it. In the course of the work, the meaning of the dream became clear to me. I noticed an intention which was realized by the dream and which must have been the motive for dreaming. The dream fulfilled a number of wishes which had been aroused in me by the events of the previous evening. I shall content myself with this one newly gained insight. If we follow the method of dream interpretation indicated here, we discover that dreams really do have a meaning. The dream represents a certain state of affairs as being as I would wish it to be. Its content is thus a wish fulfillment. Its motive, a wish." Okay, let me break that down just a little bit further. So he has the dream content, and the dream content are the images and acoustic sounds that we know as being the dream. Behind or under, or in some concealed way relative to the dream content, are the dream thoughts. And the dream content relates to the dream thoughts, but they're not the dream thoughts, right? There's a relationship between the dream content and the dream thoughts, but it's a transformed, murky kind of relationship. It's not a direct substitution. There's no decoding. There is a relationship, but the nature of it's hazy. It's tenuous. Beyond that, what he wants to say is that there's a motive behind the dream. And the motive has to do with an expression of the dream thoughts into consciousness. That motive, or the motive behind the content, and this is what he gets to, it's a wish fulfillment. It's presenting the world as the kind of place you wish you lived in. It always manifests from a way that things would be a little bit better than what they are, in some way. And again, in this case, it might be a petty little way, but it'd be better than what it is. And that's the motive behind the dream thought's expression in its dream content. Does that make sense? Okay. So the conclusion exposes the common thread that unites the disparate thoughts, or the disparate parts of the dream. It's an intentionality to create a pleasant version of reality. The work of this, I would argue, emerges from a similar space as Fichte's faith and Sartre's bad faith. It's a work of resolving the malaise that emerges from the day-to-day struggles that we face. It's a way of realizing the world as a place that we're able to inhabit. Okay? What distinguishes Freud from Sartre and Fichte is his ability to see how this work persists even into our slumbering minds. What Freud adds to our methods of existential detection is a medical perspective that functions in a way that strongly parallels and often overlaps the sort of exploration and inquiry that detectives, like those that Chandler features, engage in. A problem emerges whose origin is a mystery. Freud believes that the symptoms and dreams provided clues to an idea within the psyche that needs to be revealed in order to have its power weakened. A proper investigation requires a knowledge of existence, right? It's not just the dream that Freud uses, it's a knowledge of the patient's daily life, habits, routines, wishes, hopes, fears, memories, right? All of that needs to be there in order to have a valid interpretation of the patient's dream. You have to know the existence of the patient really, really well for the dream to be able to make sense. That's part of why Freud starts with his own dream, and that's part of why he brings in all these random details from all over his life, right? To understand a dream requires being an existential detective. Once one is that, you can follow the content of dreams and show how they're meaningful. The point of dream interpretation is to tell a story that accounts for the twists and turns of plot in order to arrive at a satisfying conclusion. The conclusion here isn't knowing the dream. The conclusion for Freud is always healing the patient. That's the point. That's what he's interested in. Does chapter 2 make a little bit more sense? Yeah.
Where does a nightmare fit into the wish fulfillment? Or is that just fears?
Um, there's a really famous nightmare that he discusses that Lacan and Zizek pick up on about like a child burning to death. And this is I haven't read this for a while, so bear with me. And I can't remember which one's Freud's interpretation versus Lacan's interpretation versus Zizek's interpretation, because they all three look at the same dream. But it starts out where, like, there's a father and looking at his son who's on fire, and the kid says, "Dad, can't you see that I'm burning?" Which is a pretty horrifying dream. One of their interpretations, again, I can't remember who. This is recall, and I can't differentiate. Is that it's meant to wake the father up from a vigil for a dead son and warn that a candle is about to fall over, right? So there's some amount of warning and urgency that emerges out of a nightmare situation that shows how to keep the world in a way that one would wish it to be, right? You don't want your son to burn, therefore you need to wake up, and that's part of what prompts the nightmare. And I am horribly apologetic if that's Zizek instead of Freud or Lacan, but I think that would be a way to figure that out.
Well, maybe getting back to what you were saying earlier, sometimes when you get too close, like he said, to that rabbit hole, you know, because it kind of reminds me of tripping, where you would get, you know, lost down this one particular hole, and the only way is for somebody to talk you back. You know, or some people just totally got lost.
Yeah. That might be.
Yeah. I think like what you're saying, if you keep following that method of interpreting it, is that the nightmare still is like teaching you how to inhabit the world, or not teach you, I guess, because you already know it somewhere in your brain.
Yeah. The other part of the wish fulfillment, even though the child's burning, the child's still alive. And that's part of it too. It's a horrifying dream, but it gives you something that you want, which is a living child instead of a dead one. And again, I don't remember whose take that was, but for Freud, inevitably, nightmare or not, it comes back to some form of wish fulfillment. And that's just the nature of the dream. All right. Chapter 5, Oedipus. The only part of chapter 5 I'm interested in tonight is acknowledging Freud's work on the case of Oedipus. I might have just thrown it. Yeah, it's just a little section of it. So he begins by discussing this in his section on typical dreams, looking at how psychoneurotics reveal, by magnifying it, quote, what goes on less clearly and less intensely in the inner life of most children, right? So he's saying that like all of the psychoneurotics are doing what all the kids do. They're just a lot bigger at it, so it makes it more visible. But you can track down what psychoneurotics do, and that thinking process is still there in every child. That's his contention. He then recounts the story of Oedipus and argues that the fact that Oedipus moves modern humans no less than the Greeks means that, quote, the effect of Greek tragedy does not depend on the contrast between fate and human will, but is to be sought in the distinctive nature of the subject matter exemplifying this contrast. I disagree with Freud on this point, obviously, and he asserts rather than argues for the position. Nonetheless, his resulting analysis is interesting. And this is what he has on pages 202 and 203. I'll just go ahead and read that. It's a longer chunk. Quote, his Oedipus's fate moves us only because it could have been our own as well. Because at our birth, the oracle pronounced the same curse upon us as it did him. It was perhaps ordained that we should all of us turn our first sexual impulses toward our mother, our first hatred and violent wishes against our father. Our dreams convince us of it. As the poet brings up Oedipus's guilt in light of the course of his own investigation, he compels us to recognize our own inner life, where those impulses, though suppressed, are still present. Like Oedipus, we live in ignorance of those wishes, offensive to morality and forced upon us by nature. And once they have been revealed, there is little doubt that we would all rather turn our gaze away from the scenes of our childhood. End quote. So that's Freud's take. What moves us about Oedipus is that we all know deep down we're Oedipus. We all have that same imprint put on us And that's what interests and horrifies us about the story.
Do you think he means that so literally as people are always attributing to him?
I mean, that's the Oedipus complex. I mean, it's part of the human condition for Freud. I mean, that's just how the human mind works. So Freud, in his analysis, ends up replaying the question of freedom and fate that we started the class with. He uses the phrase "forced upon us by nature" to replace the curse of the gods as what he means by fate, right? Instead of God, he has nature. And he invokes what, quote, we would rather all do to indicate freedom and volition. So he still has the same poles that Oedipus starts with, fate and freedom. He's still in that same parameter. He's just defining it a little bit differently. Same question, same framework for meaning. Rather than the nature, however, the insurmountable obstacle and oracle rests in the unconscious. Our dreams reveal a wish to murder our fathers and sleep with our mothers, and it's a wish that must be disguised and only allowed to come out in a moment of catharsis whose power I cannot allow myself to understand. I don't get why I like Oedipus, but watching Oedipus helps me cathart all of my Oedipal feelings without ever recognizing that they're there. That's why I'm moved inexplicably by watching the play. And that's for Freud why it has so much power now, even though we have nothing to do with the Greek world anymore. Those gods are meaningless to us. We don't believe in curses. Nonetheless, Oedipus's plight moves us precisely because we're Oedipus. That's history. Chapter 6, the dream work. Does that make sense? Okay. So having discussed the work of dream interpretation, I now turn to the nature of the dream work, which Freud describes in chapter 6. By this point in the book, Freud has differentiated the dream's manifest content as it is present in the memory and the latent dream content, or the dream thoughts. Same split as here, right? The dream content, the manifest content is the stuff that we remember, the images and the sounds. The latent dream content are the dream thoughts that we're unconscious of, okay? The manifest relates to the images described. This is the text and transcription of Irma's injection. The latent references of the dream's desire for wish fulfillment, right? Those kinds of motives. He then describes them as, quote, two versions of the same content in two different languages, or rather, the dream content looks to us like a translation of the dream thoughts into another mode of expression, and we are supposed to get to know its signs and laws of grammatical instruction by comparing the original and the translation. Okay, so in other words, after a patient has had a dream interpreted, you should know what the dream thought is, you can see what the dream content is. Once you have those down, you can look and see how that interpretation or that translation occurs that starts from here and ends up here, and start to figure out what the mind's grammar is, or the logic of dream making that produces this out of this. Okay, so that's what he explores in this chapter. The first work that he wants to talk about is what he calls condensation. On page 212, he says that it becomes noticeable in the fact that the dream is, quote, scant, paltry, laconic in comparison to the range and abundance of the dream thoughts. Written down, the dream will fill half a page. The analysis containing the dream thoughts will require 6, 8, 12 times as much space. The quota of condensation is indeterminable. Right? So his first warrant for condensation is looking at the size of the dream text. Oh, my dream is this. It's a paragraph long. Here are the dream thoughts that attach to it in analysis. So he's saying all of this gets condensed into that. Number 2. Freud also mentions that, quote, each element of the dream content turns out to be overdetermined, to be represented many times and in many ways in the dream thoughts. It is not only that the elements of the dream are determined many times over, but also that the individual dream thoughts are represented in the dream by several elements. The path of associations leads from one element of the dream to several dream thoughts, and from one dream thought to several dream elements. That's page 215. The dream work thus translates thoughts into elements in different ways, requiring detectives to become flexible in interpreting dreams. And this is one big reason why neither the decoding nor the symbolism approaches are terribly helpful, right? So, in other words, like you have all of these elements of the dream, and they all relate. I mean, that's what he was saying about like the 3 different women, any one of whom could be any one of them at any time. right? Any one woman is actually any of the three. They're condensed into one figure, but which one that is at any one time, it deals with the dream thoughts, right? So the three women are condensed into one figure. Who that figure is could change, but it's still condensed into one woman who is all three, nonetheless one. I mean, this makes sense because you've dreamed before, right? You've all had dreams, you understand how, like, oh, it was kind of my best friend from elementary school, but it was also like my college roommate and also the kind of jerk who worked with me in my first job. It was all of them, but not one of them, but it was, I just knew it was, you know what I mean? That's condensation. Does that make sense? Okay. 3, condensation also means that dreams produce new unities in the form of collective figures and composite structures. Many of the elements of a dream are hybrids, and they do not signify a single thing or single thought at all. Okay, so go back to your elementary school best friend, the jerk you worked with, and your college roommate. It's a composite figure, right? It's a hybrid unity, but it's not like it represents one thing. It represents a bunch of things. It's a complex figure, right? And it's hard to track down. And so that's what he's saying with condensation. Any element that you have listed in your description of the dream is complex. There's a lot of hybridization that goes into creating each one of those elements. And that's why it takes so much space in the dream thought to interpret and analyze what it means. Condensation. Does that make sense? The second work that he argues occurs is displacement. Freud writes, quote, he first argues that spoken words remembered from, this is a quote, remembered from dreams are either retained intact or are slightly altered in expression. Frequently, they are a patchwork of various utterances remembered from the day. In this process, the actual words remain the same, but their sense is altered to yield a different meaning or multiple meanings. Speech in dreams often functions merely as an allusion to an event which was accompanied by the words remembered. So if you have a dream and you remember certain words were said in a conversation as you're writing the dream text down, those words are important not for what they say, but as a way of anchoring that into a content that you still remember from a previous day, right? They're not significant in what the words are, they're significant from what they point back to in your own memory or in your own life. Does that make sense? It's displaced from its original occurrence, but that original occurrence is still important. That's part of displacement. Second, Freud adds that, and this is pages 232 through 233, quote, the elements pushing to the fore in the dream content as essential compounds, or as essential components, certainly did not play the same part in the dream thoughts. As a corollary, the statement can also be reversed. What is clearly essential in the content of the dream thought does not need to be represented in the dream itself at all. The dream, one might say, is centered differently. Its content is ordered in a center made up of elements other than the dream thoughts, right? So in the quote-unquote plot of a dream, there's a really important thing that's going to happen, right? This is the big thing. This is the thing that the dream points to. But the thing of the manifest content is not the same thing as the center of the dream thought. It's displaced. What's important in the dream narrative is displaced from the actual dream thought that would govern its content. This is part of what makes dreams hard to interpret for Freud. Does that make sense? Do you get what a displacement does? It shifts the emphasis from the thought to the content, and it dislocates it to make it harder to track down. Is that okay? Okay. The combination of condensation and displacement lead Freud to theorize that, quote, a psychical power is operative in the dream that, number one, strips the psychically valuable elements of their intensity, 2, creates new values by way of overdetermination out of elements of low value, and 3, it is the new values that then reach the dream content. All right, so think about it in terms of if you have a secret that you want to keep, but you know it's going to have to come out somehow, what code are you going to make sure the secret stays secret even though something is expressed? Well, you're going to tell the truth, but you're going to emphasize, like, here's a little detail here. I'm going to blow this up to become something that's big here, and what's big here will just become a little thing over here, right? That will help disguise it. Does that make sense? it's the intensity, like the most intense part down here becomes stripped and shorn and becomes something very weak and very light afterthought, right? And so all of those, all the values in the dream thought are reversed and reordered and reorganized. So it's hard to tell here what's going on here. That's the point of the dream. Make sense? Quote, if this is what happens, then a transference and displacement of the psychical intensity of the individual elements has taken place. As a consequence, the difference between the texts of the dream content and the dream thoughts makes its appearance. The process that we are assuming here is the essential part of the dream work. It has earned the name of dream displacement. Dream displacement and dream condensation are the two foremen in charge of the dream work. And we may put the shaping of our dreams down mainly to their activity, right? So we never see the dream. The other way of looking at it, we never know what the dream thinks. Before we get to the dream thought, the two foremen of the dream work do their thing, right? You get some condensation here, you get some displacement there, and what emerges into our consciousness as a dream is irrevocably reshaped and reformed, right? We don't see our dream thought. We just see the dream content that's already been filtered and altered, right? It's been disguised and doctored in a way that we can't get back to directly. That's the point of the two dream foremen. Freud has considered that the major influence motivating these two strategies is a need for what he calls censorship, that keeps unconscious those thoughts that we would have that would trouble our conscious lives. We don't want to know who we are or what we think. We really don't. We really don't want to know what we really are. We really don't want to know what we really think. And the best way to do that is to have a censor in the mind that as soon as anything would trouble your conscious mind, like, oh, I have a desire to kill my father, have sex with my mom, like those kinds of things. No, I'm not that kind of person. It just never becomes conscious. How doesn't it? Because there's a bouncer at the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious who says, yeah, you can't do that. You know, or it's a censor who just says, no, this isn't happening. Go away. Just stay unconscious. And what happens when a dream is when we're tired, that sensor's a little sloppy. So some stuff gets through, but it's only able to sneak through with the fake ID, right? The fake ID is the work of condensation and displacement that make it look like it's something other than what it is. And that's how it can slip past the sensor. And it can only even do that when the sensor's tired at night, right? Sensor's on guard. You usually don't have hallucinations. I mean, without help, generally, right? So, all right, page 243. Freud adds that dreams have difficulties expressing negations. Dreams don't say a lot of no. Opposites and contradictions are made into unities within a dream. The only expression of a contradiction that appears in a dream occurs when something is unable to be carried out. Right? So you don't have opposites in dreams. Every opposite in a dream, every or translates into an and. Right? Instead of this or that would be a contradiction, it all becomes an and in the dream. The only way to experience a negation is when something can't be done. It's just a little random insight. Page 255. Additionally, Freud finds that dreams wish to, quote, separate the dream thoughts to the most economical and unified expression possible in ways that resemble puns, which are individual words that are pregnant with ambiguity. Right? Our minds are really, really clever. We're really good at making puns, and the dream work exploits that by letting one figure stand for five. Right? That's what the pun does. It's an economical expression that lets two or three different meanings be carried in the same expression. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 319. Freud adds a third strategy of the dream work, which he claims is a variety of censorship. And these are interpolations and additions. He claims, quote, these interpolations are often easy to recognize. They're announced timidly, introduced with an as if, are not in themselves particularly vivid, and they are always found in places where they can function to link two bits of the dream content or set up a connection between two parts of the dream. The memory retains them less easily than the true offspring of the dream material. If the dream is forgotten, they are the first to vanish. The result of its labors is that the dream loses its appearance of absurdity and incoherence, and approaches the pattern of an intelligible experience. But its labors are not always crowned with total success. Right? These interpolations are additions. I mean, imagine a dream. Like, so you have all these dream thoughts that can't be expressed, and they've already been muddled with and tampered with and messed up. And so you have these weird images and things that don't go together very well. He's saying that the third part of the dream work is just to kind of sew them together, to stitch them together, to add just kind of continuity to make it look like a narrative, so that the dream looks more like a story. But when you wake up and you think back on it, this is the stuff that disappears, right? You don't remember that. And so it's like, oh, that was a really weird dream. But as you're dreaming it, it seems to make far more sense. Why, of course, I'm in a submarine in the desert chasing a fish. Wait, and then when you wake up, it doesn't make any sense. But the dream work does a good enough job of interpolating and adding things into it to create something that's like a narrative that we can follow as we're dreaming. Yeah.
Is Freud assessing this from the patient or the dreamer telling the dream?
So this is based on a whole bunch of patients that he's done this with, right? So he has a whole bunch of patients that he's talked to. He knows their lives, their fears, their wishes, their hopes, their traumas, their memories, their past, the random, just kind of day-to-day stuff that they talk about in therapy. Out of all of that, he then takes a dream, and he can interpret that dream relative to their existence, guess at the dream thought, and then make predictions as he's analyzing the dream about which parts connect to what. Okay, so he's been doing this for years. He takes all of that and he starts to think about, well, okay, what are the processes that always seem to be at work in making the dream what it is, rather than the dream thought? And these are the three things that he comes up with. So this is the logic or the grammar of a dream that makes the dream content appear the way that it does out of dream thoughts that are always predicated on wish fulfillment.
But are they responding to him that, yes, that's what was going on?
Usually what he does, he'll venture things, but again, it's always, his practice is always curative, right? And so he knows when he stumbled on something that's the right answer. It doesn't matter whether it's historically right. Like, it doesn't matter if this is true in a historical sense. It's true if the patient is cured when the patient repeats it. That's what makes it a true guess. Its truth comes in its curative power, right? Whether that's biographically true or historical true, totally irrelevant. But Freud can always tell when he has understood the dream, because when the patient repeats that back with conviction, it's cured. Does that make sense? I mean, it's got an absolute litmus test, so a patient can say, oh, yeah, that's totally right, because there's nothing curative that comes with it.
And I think that as far as like when you apply that dream grammar to your own dreams, it makes perfect sense. Especially like interpolations is a great thing that it's so nebulous, but it's definitely true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's just, and also when you, again, like Jake was saying, like if you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, that's why I have that weird like jerk I worked with. Like that's where those figures come from. That's condensation. And when somebody says, I think you're really kind of jealous of that guy. Oh, that's what that dream means, of course, right? Total displacement, very obvious when you recognize it. Total displacement in the content, So I think it's a lot of that work that makes it a fairly convincing way to think about dream work. Does that make sense? Okay. So, okay. Dreams, in other words, create narratives. If you think of this in terms of film, this is this work of the dream translates the images into a motion picture, not by speeding up the images in succession, that's merely a temporal connection, but by providing a narrative logic that weaves together isolated images into something like a story. Freud argues that this is related to our efforts to make a coherent and intelligible whole of the sensory impressions presenting themselves to us, which lead to the oddest mistakes or an ability to falsify the truth of the material before us, including our way of reading over a typo, right? Our minds have a habit, like how many of you read over typos when you're reading? And you're like, oh wait, that doesn't say that. Like I read it the way it was supposed to be, not what it says. Our minds automatically help things make more sense than they actually do. And this interpolation addition part of the dream work is our mind just saying, what is all this bizarre sensory, oh, this is what it is. And it's our mind forcing it to make some sort of sense. What does sense mean? It means narrative. It means story. That's what it means. Do these three parts of the dream work make sense? Okay. Yeah.
One thing you're talking about displacement and condensation as being because of censorship and us not really wanting to know the truth. Then what is pushing those thoughts through?
So he has. It's really interesting how science gets used as a model that has different things. So I mean, if you look at how human beings have thought of consciousness, like Freud's famous one is the like magic writing pad. You know those tablets that had the wax sheet of paper and you press down on it and then you just pull up the sheet of paper and it'd erase. For him, the magic writing pad was a technology that introduced, because it still leaves a trace on the wax underneath it, right? Like you can always see those traces, even though the content seems to have disappeared. If you look at the actual black, whatever that was, you can see it, right? I mean, nobody knows what the magic writing pad is anymore. You know, like, I don't, do you know? Are you familiar?
Sounds like an Etch-a-Sketch.
Yeah, but it was like you had to push down on it to make it go, right?
Wax.
Yeah. And so it would leave a trace underneath. And for Freud, that was revelatory. Now people think of themselves as computers or phones, right? With different processes and programs and subroutines. It's a different technological model. When Freud was writing, thermodynamics had come into vogue. And you know, it's a theory of different pressures. And so he thought of the unconscious, like censorship. I mean, you know people who are repressed, right? They're under a lot of pressure. Well, that pressure has to release somehow. In a thermodynamic model of consciousness, that pressure is released through dreams. And that's why they have to come out, because there's too much pressure and something has to give. So they push their way out through the surface during the time where the sensor's tired. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
So dreams aren't necessarily meant to be interpreted from that.
No, you're not supposed to. I mean, don't look there. I mean, no. Like, you're supposed to forget about them upon waking. I mean, they're meant to be forgotten, but we don't always. And they mean something. Not predictive, right? But they do mean something about who we are and what we wish for. And to know what we wish for, or to quote one of the great sages of the late 20th century, the Spice Girls, it can tell us what we want, what we really, really want. And we never want to know what we really, really want. That's unconscious. That's the stuff we don't look at or talk about or think about. And if we ignore it, it's not quite there. But for Freud, that's what it means to be an existential detective. Who we really, really are is equated to what we really, really want. And if you want to know who you are, you gotta ask what you really, really want. And that requires this kind of detective work. Very different kind of detective work than what Sartre used, right? But it's still, do you see how it's still existential detection? Does that make sense? Different theory, different assumptions about what it means to be human. Very, very important, I think.
What's the time frame between Freud and Sartre?
Freud's career was ending at about the time that Sartre's was starting. So, I mean, Sartre mostly wrote in the 40s through the 60s, and Freud was late 19th century through the 20s, 30s. So I think he died in the early 40s, late 30s, something like that. Maybe even a little later. Somewhere around. I mean, but that's roughly where they were. All right, ready for chapter 7? This is the psychology of the dream process, where Freud offers an explanation for why the dream works the way it does. And this is where Freud becomes an existential detective in a deeper sense. He looks at the motivation for the way humans exist at a structural level and not just on a case-by-case basis. This chapter begins as Freud theorizes a primary and a secondary system of consciousness. The primary process is one that resembles, in some ways, Fichte's conversation with spirit. One attempts to assuage internal unpleasure by imagining its resolution. He writes that, quote, an impulse of this kind is what we call a wish. The reappearance of the perception is the fulfillment of the wish, and when the perception is fully charged with the excitation aroused by the need, that is the shortest path to wish fulfillment. His examples are great. I really do like Freud. So he talks about a kid who goes to bed wanting, I think, like a strawberry shortcake, right? And so the kid's sitting there wishing for a strawberry shortcake, and voila, dreams of a strawberry shortcake, right? That enters into the perceptive field. It's like, sweet, I've got a strawberry shortcake. ... Wakes up, still hungry, no strawberry shortcake. That's the primary process, right? If I can see it in my mind, I get it. I can perceive it. Awesome. Doesn't work. And that's for Freud where the secondary process comes in, and it emerges as a result of, quote, the bitter experience of life, which requires that we think in more adaptive ways. The shortcut doesn't work. We cannot, by imagining that we're eating a carrot cake, become more full or satisfy our sweet tooth cravings. It doesn't work. So we need a secondary process. Otherwise, all we would do is just sit around dreaming of what we do and just starve to death, right? Like, ooh, that looks good. And I mean, internet usage does a lot of that. Like, you have a lot of like instant gratification of the primary process. Like, ooh, I want to see what's on Hulu or Netflix, and you just watch and watch, and you get everything you want, and you just lethargically dwindle into dust. So,
well, that would kind of answer nightmares too of kids reading grim fairy tales before going to bed.
well, Grimm's fairy tales are nothing but psychopathology. I mean, it's nothing but the id just erupting out into like animals eating grandmothers and being cut open and having the pop back. I mean, they're horrifying because they're they're dream content, basically. A lot of them. I mean, it's fascinating stuff. Okay, so these processes emerge from different levels of consciousness. This is Freud's take. Number one, so Freud gives 3 different levels of what consciousness means. One is consciousness. He and Start agree that we have consciousness. That's about all they'll agree on. For Freud, there's also the preconscious and then the unconscious. Technically, both of these are unconscious. This is just kind of like the antechamber, like, you know, the little waiting room to get into consciousness. You're not quite in, but this is stuff that could be conscious, and it's still unconscious, but it could be conscious. This is stuff that will never, ever, ever become conscious. Okay? Sartre thinks that this is baloney. We'll use that word, right? It just doesn't exist. All we have is consciousness, period. That's it. For Freud, there's something deeper. And I think they both have good arguments. I think that they're both right in different ways, which makes me not liked by many Freudians or Sartreans. But, you know, I think they both have real insight into what it means to be a human being.
And Jung was on the other end of more unconscious, huh?
Yeah.
Just the
And here are the patterns of it. And, yep. Okay, so here's Freud's descriptions of these 3. Number 1, consciousness is, quote, a sensory organ for the apprehension of psychical qualities. And it acquires data from the perceptual system as well as the psychical system's sensation of pleasure and unpleasure. Right? The consciousness is an organ, or it's an interface that lets you have the perceptive stuff as well as the psychic stuff, and it kind of fuses them together. It has a limited function, however, especially relative to Fichte or Sartre. So for Freud, like for Fichte and Sartre, consciousness sees everything. For Freud, he describes consciousness as a flashlight in a vast warehouse. Right? It can shine a light on some things, but it's mostly kept in the dark. Consciousness doesn't really help us. It's very limited. Number 2, preconsciousness. This is a part of the unconscious that's distinguished by information consciousness potentially is able to find. In order to become accessed by consciousness, it must submit to the rigors of a sensor that removes all information that would cause unpleasure. A process Freud calls repression. Freud writes of it, quote, there are now, as it were, 2 sensory surfaces. One turned toward the processes of perceiving, the other toward processes of thinking. It is responsible for waning memories and for binding excited thoughts that would trouble consciousness, thoughts that are only vented through dreaming. This is technically part of the unconscious, but it has the potential of providing information to consciousness, right? So once it's in the preconscious, it can give consciousness information, right? It can show it things, but not everything, because it has to have all of its unpleasure limited out or filtered out. We won't become conscious of everything in our preconsciousness, but it's possible. That which is censored at this level, however, is not completely forgotten. Its unsuitability needs to be recognized enough to be thwarted should thought move in that direction, right? So if something gets up into the preconscious and the bouncer's like, no, you can't go to consciousness, it's retained enough at this doorway to let you know that there's something there. Because it has to be there in case it tries to sneak back in. Like, dude, you're on the list. I've already said you can't come in, right? So that thought isn't conscious, but it's conscious enough to know that you can't think about it. Does that make sense? You have to be able to recognize what you don't want to let in, but that leaves some information behind, right? So you repress it, but you can't forget that you've forgotten it. You can only tell yourself, I can't remember it, which reminds you that it's there, but you can't look. So that's the preconscious. The unconscious here, quote, nothing is brought to an end, nothing is past or forgotten. Everything we think and experience, everything, not just what we're conscious of thinking, is stored here. So all the little details and sounds and joys and smells of life are here. You do not forget them. There is no time, there is no past, there is no present, there is no future. It's all stored in the unconscious. Consciousness may lose its ability to access these thoughts and impressions, even ones that don't have unpleasure, right? It's just the stuff you forget. It's still stored. It's at this level that our deepest impulses and desires are formed. Freud's later models of the psyche, the ego, id, and superego, build out from this, right? The id lurks in the unconscious. That's where the id and the libido stem from. Most of the wishes and desires would be too shocking to become conscious. They cause too much unpleasure when entering the system, and so remain repressed. And that's his theory of the psyche that explains why dreams work the way that they do. Does that make sense? All right, here are the implications. Number one, Freud examines the core of our existence in terms of what remains unavailable and unknown to us. His skills as a detective are required to navigate through the traces that emerge as manifest content, symptoms and dreams, in order to guess at the latent content, or the dream thoughts. The function of this is curative. He wants to heal his patients and reveal to them the disguised wish that plagues them. And just like every fairy tale and every horror story, once you say its name, it loses its power. It's true. It's how it works in the human mind. Number two, interpreting dreams and symptoms isn't enough. Freud pushes deeper in order to explore what is true about humans that would give rise to dreams that operated in this particular way. It is in this way that he understands the importance of the censor, the process of repression, the schemes of displacement and condensation, and the mystery of the unconscious as incredibly significant to our lives. Number three, the act of interpretation as Freud performs it involves storytelling at two levels. First, the dreamer is required to re-narrate the story of the dream, recreating its narrative process through the distortions of forgetfulness and coherence. Second, the interpreter is required to know the existential elements of the patient's life in a way that will help make sense of the interconnections that merge with the dream. And finally, the interpreter needs to retell this narrative in a way that allows the patient to understand it, become relieved of the symptoms. And this, too, is a work that is simultaneously fiction and detection involving existence. You're making up a story based on what you detected to help heal somebody's inner being. Any questions? Is that helpful? Interesting? Excellent. There's no new reading for next week.
Most people dream at the level, like on Freud's dreams that he analyzed. I mean, they were extensive. Do most people dream that extensively?
We had troubled people though, too.
Yeah, I mean,
But I'm talking about the dreams of his own.
All his own.
I mean, part of it is just getting the habit of attending to it. I mean, people who are lucid dreamers or people who keep dream journals, you get better at it the more you do it. You know, if you don't ever pay attention, I never pay attention to my dreams. I can't remember anything I dream. But the people who do, I know, are really good at remembering and recounting And the more you attend to it, the more you get in the habit of writing it down, the better you get. It's a skill that you can develop. Does that answer your question?
I mean,
It
everybody.
does. I mean, I just don't dream much. So it amazes me.
Or you do, you just don't recall it. Like, that's the difference.
Well, and everybody has sometimes really bizarrely memorable dreams.
I
Don't-
remember my bad dreams, but
Oh,
I
those
don't
are.
ever remember good dreams.
Other questions?
I'm gonna go check out the Cubs dreams.
Yeah, that's a good thing. I'll be heading my way to that one myself.